Hi, it's me, Roosevelt. So, we got some really good lore this patch about, Leroy, the 7th Descender. Nah, I'm JK. I've still been thinking about fate and destiny, and a particular concept called Fortuna. Now, we've heard about Stella Fortuna since the beginning of the game, with character constellations. In Latin, this means star luck, but in the original Chinese, these items are called stars of destiny. But since we've arrived in Fontaine, we've gotten quite a few new definitions of Fortuna, and this all has a lot to do with ancient Remuria and Narzissenkreuz. So I first need to start with a brief recap of Rene's world formula. Back in 3.6, we first came across Rene's investigation notes. It's here that Rene first calculated his world formula. The world formula is a mathematical prediction of the end of the world. Specifically, the star beast shall drink the amniotic fluid of the world dry, and 100 years from then, all life on the surface would be eradicated. The world left behind would be inhospitable to life such that not a single mint or sweet flower could grow. And mint can grow like everywhere, so that's saying a lot. So Rene had calculated this over and over and over again, because it would always yield the same result, the apocalypse. The entire motivation behind everything Rene and Narzissenkreuz did is to avoid this apocalypse. So the plan ends up being to dissolve everyone so that they may condense the will of everyone into a singular will. This concept of will is important. Abyssal Power and Khaenri'ah both have a will and can rewrite the rules. And a Descender has a will strong enough to rival a world. Through this, Rene aspired to achieve Descender-like status, but failed. Regardless, the world was saved, nevertheless. See, Rene's calculations were largely correct, with some shifting values, but he didn't factor in a major variable, the Traveler. The star beast of the world formula was the whale, and with its defeat, the crisis was averted. Even if you happen to do the Narzissenkreuz quest before Act 5, Rene sees that the star beast will be defeated because of this variable. Now, as a side note, I know a question many people might have is, was the world formula the same thing as the prophecy? Because they speak of entirely different things, with Fortuna crying in one, and the star beast devouring the waters in the other. But during the trial in the Archon quest, we deduce that the root cause of the events surrounding the prophecy is the whale. So, you can think about the prophecy and the world formula being two sides of the same coin, with the whale being the coin. One is the history of the future, and the other is a predictive calculation. But I'll get back to this and the whale later. But here's the thing I want to focus on with the world formula. In the enigmatic pages, Rene compares his world formula to Fortuna. It's this ancient concept of kingdoms rising and falling, and then rising again. The highlight here is that Rene's formula calculates a final end, where civilization would not rise again. And Rene dismisses Fortuna as crude observations without any scientific merit. And just because Rene loves dunking on ancient civilizations, that doesn't mean Fortuna isn't interesting or significant. And I think understanding Remuria is an important part of this. A few minutes of background here. Sometime after the fall of Gurabad in Sumeru, the god king Remus received divine revelations and descended upon Meropes on his golden ship, also named Fortuna. He was accompanied by a prophetess named Sibylla, who took the form of a golden bee. Remus founded Remuria and brought prosperity and music and arts to his kingdom, but the seers prophesied the destruction of the kingdom. So Remus would pursue his plans to dominate the land and avoid said destruction. But even gods cannot escape fate's decree, and amongst many of his sins, the greatest sin of Remus was trying to escape destined judgment. The Fontaine Ascension materials fill in the details of what exactly transpired. Basically, after Remus arrived, he received a goblet which could refine a mysterious dewdrop from the primordial waters. This refined dewdrop was the golden insoluble ichor. In his pursuit of his eternal kingdom and transcendence, he would use this ichor to preserve wisdom and memories, and, with an immortal stone, he would place the souls of people into golems. But mortals could not endure the pain, and their suffering would dye the golden ichor black. So Remus created golem armies, and would go around on his ship conquering tribes to join his kingdom. But at some point, these people of a bygone era, including barbarians and bishops, rebelled against Remus's tyranny. In the end, both Remus's guard and the rebels would sink into a chasm of eternal darkness, and Remus's dream of defying fate sank into nothingness. So that's a very brief history of Remuria. Aside from Remus's ship being named Fortuna, there's another use of Fortuna. The prophecy of destruction. The greatest kingdom will face the most utter destruction, and this is Fortuna. Oceans will rise, empires will fall, the only constant is change. So this is the crux of Rene's comparisons to the world formula, the perpetual rising and falling and rising of civilizations. But in the history of Remuria, there's another definition of Fortuna. In Master Ruggiero's notes, he writes, "Fortuna appears to be the title of a symphony. Ancient documents record the existence of such great symphonies that were connected to the fundamental power. The gods of this previous civilized era seem to have ruled Fontaine using the power of symphonies." So Fortuna is a ship, a symphony, and also destiny? Although in my personal opinion, I could totally see Remus naming his ship after Destiny as a way to stick it to the man. He wanted to escape fate's decree after all. But Fortuna as a grand symphony gets a little complicated. According to this one Dewdrop Ascension mat, the golden ichor itself was Remus's unfinished grand symphony, a boundless, sourceless golden ichor replacing the wild primeval waters and the glorious immortal sages bringing nectar-like enlightenment to the ignorant corners of the world. So let's explore this a little bit. Here's the thing. When you read the history book on Remuria, there's a lot about music. Remus composed a harmonious symphony in his kingdom. He listened to every melody of the land, and hearing any discord, he would correct it with a pluck of his strings. He shared his authority with 4 humans to help protect the Symphony of Universal Harmony, eliminating any discordant sounds. Even the position titles are musical. Remus is the Universal Harmost, with the 4 humans being regular Harmosts, I guess? Harmost is actually a Spartan term for a military general, but shares its etymological root with the word harmony. Now, at the very least, music here is being used as a metaphor for Remus's complete order and reign, and his desire to create his kingdom's own fate. Perhaps in this motif of attempting to defy fate, Remus named the golden ichor Fortuna, just like he did with his musical ship that would spread his melodies. But Remurian society was completely centered around music. Remurian language itself was based in music. Taillefer, Ruggiero, and a Narzissenkreuz note all describe their indecipherable phonography and how they used music to record everything, even magic. Ruggiero also speaks about trying to find evidence of the grand symphonies. These conches were tools used by this ancient civilization to convey some kind of information. In that same room with this note, you see one of these giant conches. It's actually pretty similar to the conch in the Echoes of the Ancient World quest. In that quest, you find Remurian sheet music, the Melodie of Vesta, and use the conch as a harp to play it. Topias says that in the legend, this melody would transport listeners to a fantastical dreamland. It doesn't, but it does wipe Paimon's fatigue away. So this makes me wonder if music was literally being used to have some effect on people. This isn't even that outlandish of an idea when you remember that we have all cried or been moved by music at some point in our lives before. And if you've ever gotten goosebumps, there's actually a term for that. It's called frisson. But consider this. Taillefer also says that in legend, Remuria once built a massive musical instrument, even grander than the opera house, that was capable of playing music even to the dome of the sky. This is just me pondering aloud, but imagine if music that could take listeners to a dream world were played on a conch of that size. I mean, it's not like we've seen other examples of trying to put a bunch of people in a dream or anything, or of someone playing a sound that puts us to sleep or resets a dream. Just some food for thought. Now, this has all been a scattering of cool observations, but I've led you astray from the main topic of destiny and fate. So to get back on track, the lightless silk string has a description that starts tying some things together. In ancient Fontaine, some thought that Fortuna, which ruled the world, was woven from countless fibers, like the strings of a harp. Strings that resonate with the majestic music would bring happiness to all, while discord would destroy the fabric of the universe. This is obviously interesting because it not only compares fate to music, but also to weaving and fabric. You know, like threads of fate or loom of fate. And this also reminds me of some interpretations of the Greek fates, or the Moirai, singing of the past, present, and future as they weave fate. I mainly bring this up because Mona actually sings or hums when she's looking at the stars. Now, her outfit description and second character story don't necessarily say she's scrying, but perhaps in general, we're getting at something here with music, stars, and destiny. And I also don't think it's a coincidence that so much of the foundational lore relates to music. For example, how the Moon Sisters are named Aria, Canon, and Sonnet, and how the Seelies sang beautiful songs, and how Venti knows every song of the past, present, and future, etc. So I have an idea for connecting music and fate and stars. And as a disclaimer, we're getting into a heavy speculation territory, so you've been warned. So to preface, music is inherently mathematical, at least to some degree. Like sound is a wave that has a frequency, and the pitch of a note is determined by frequency. And you can use ratios of these frequencies to make intervals, like an octave or a perfect fifth. This music-math relationship has long been known and is largely attributed to famous triangle man Pythagoras, and inspired a lot of ideas about harmony in the universe. The Musica Universalis, or music of the spheres, is a philosophical concept, also associated with Pythagoreanism, that builds upon this music-math relationship and integrates astronomy. In this model, the cosmos is made up of concentric spheres. It's got layers like an onion, and each layer was occupied by a planet, with the outermost being the sphere of the fixed stars, like a firmament. The movement of these spheres is dictated by mathematical equations and thus resonate to produce music. This music produced by the planets and the stars wasn't said to be audible. It's more a higher form of music, one that could only be heard by the soul. The Roman historian Boethius, who also happens to share a name with one of Genshin Remus's Harmos, believed there to be 3 types of music: one of the spheres, one of the human body, and just regular audible music, but they were all a reflection of divinity. Plato was also generally influenced by the thought of Pythagoras, and in his Timaeus says that the creator formed the universe according to math and harmony. So, in a sense, the Platonic universe could be seen as a symphony composed by the creator. It's interesting to note that this creator is the Platonic demiurge, or craftsman, but is distinct from the Gnostic demiurge. So here's what I want to speculate on. Perhaps Fortuna is a combination of music of the spheres and fate being written in the stars. Imagine that the heavenly principles created fate or Fortuna and the fake sky full of stars, with music as a medium. We've already had so many comparisons of fate to theater, so to me, I could see music being a natural extension of that, like in a musical or an opera, perhaps. Now, I know this discussion about Fortuna has mostly been focused on Remuria, but as I said, important musical themes appear in many other places. Another example would be Aranyaka. Music is very important to the Aranara, but near the end of the quest chain, Arama mentions how Rugadavada, or Nahida, would sing, and how their power was so great because their tune was so close to the source song. This source song, as far as I know, has never been mentioned since. But I'm reminded of what Ruggiero said, that grand symphonies are connected to the fundamental power, yet another term yet to be mentioned anywhere else. Both the source song and fundamental power remind me of the fundamental frequency, which is big in music theory. I don't have any expanded thoughts on this though, because this is just based on vibes only. So this may all just be wild speculation on my part, but let's keep playing in this creative space for a bit, because there's something else. The music of the spheres is based on the idea that the universe is just mathematical equations, but Fortuna itself seems to be a loosey-goosey term for fate as a symphony, so they seem to be at odds. But good thing then, I started off this entire video talking about a computational schema that strongly resembles Fortuna. Fortuna, as Rene would describe it, is a crude concept similar to his world formula, but bereft of any robust quantifiability. I mean, Rene basically mathed his way into predicting the whale, not even mentioned in the prophecy. So what exactly was Rene calculating? And here's my tinfoil hat time. I think Rene picked up some skills in astronomy. Hear me out. There's a furnishing you can get in Arenias that looks like an armillary sphere, which is used to study objects in the sky. It mentions a certain researcher and a night of agonizing calculations. There are a few candidates for this researcher, but I think this refers to Rene and his painstaking recalculations of his world formula over and over and over again. And I also don't think Rene would consider himself an ordinary researcher content to accept the stars' movement as fate's decree. But we also have to consider the origin of the world formula. See, Rene originally was trying to deduce Khaenri'ah's world formula, which was centered on some philosophy of conflict. And we also know Rene was quite familiar with the Universitas Magistrorum, as Jacob imagines the dunk Rene would have on them. Given a lot of context clues, the Universitas Magistrorum seems to be from Khaenri'ah. And what we do know of the Magistrorum from the Orbit's achievement name card is that they were tracking the paths of stars. In particular, perhaps two specific stars with a descender flavor. So perhaps they created their world formula by studying the stars. As a side note, if Khaenri'ah had created a world formula, it's unclear to me if it's exactly the same as Rene's, but this would imply, nevertheless, that Khaenri'ah may have foreseen their own cataclysm. And if Rene is cooking up his ideas based on Khaenri'ah knowledge, perhaps Khaenri'ah had also sought out a will that can rival the world, perhaps to avoid said cataclysm. Maybe the entire motivation behind opposing the gods is breaking free from the shackles of fate and Fortuna, and cycles of destruction. It's at this point I finally want to get back to the prophecy and how it relates to the world formula. This is speculation, but perhaps Rene captured the essence of Fortuna with these repeating cycles of destruction, and Egeria's prophecy is actually just one of those cycles. This is actually suggested in one of Risley's character stories. Even if rising and falling were common in the world, then that great sea that once swallowed Remuria may perhaps return someday. In that sense, the prophecy was not really a prophecy then, but was instead the expression of a rational pattern. oceans will rise, kingdoms will fall, the only constant is change. This would have a lot of implications about Egeria's sin. So like, Fontaine has had a lot of flooding before, also associated with sin. According to the history of the decline and fall of Remuria, the author Pultini suggests that the unified civilization actually met its demise by coveting the power of the divine, which would definitely be a sin in the eyes of divinity. Remus had a long list of sins, and his kingdom met an ill fate. The first deluge, as described by Jacob, occurred during the Khaenri'ah cataclysm, which had a lot of sinners, and he describes the predicted cataclysm of the world formula as being the second deluge. So I wonder if sin is actually an inherent and maybe even predictable part of these cycles of destruction. And as for how Rene could have predicted the Star Beast, or the whale, we don't know much about the whale other than it being Sertologi's pet and also Child's constellation. It could be simply related to the constellation, and Rene inferred something from that. Alternatively, the description for the all-devouring narwhal compares the starry sky to the ocean, which may be teeming with life. So I wonder if there are actually many star beasts out there trying to infiltrate the borders, and perhaps the big ones may have their own orbital frequencies, mathematically predictable orbits or movements, you could say. I actually have a lot more thoughts on the whale, but I'm still cooking on that. But for a little preview of what I'm thinking, it should be no surprise that this once again goes back to Mr. Nine, the author of Flowers for Princess Fischl and Legend of the Shattered Halberd, especially with my posit that fate is like an opera. So stay tuned for that, I guess. There are two topics I've admittedly avoided in this entire discussion, and that's Sertology and the spiritual root cycles mentioned by the Narzissenkreuz notes. That's mostly because this video is long enough already, and these deserve a deep dive of their own. And also, I have a single brain cell, and that's already maxed out on its processing capabilities. I'm sure they're all related. For example, it's probably no coincidence that there are 4 root cycles, and symphonies usually have 4 movements, amongst other things, but it is simply unwieldy to try and cover them all while still being digestible. Fortunately for y'all, there have been a lot of other creators tackling these topics. The Laughing Man has a fantastic video on Sertology, which I highly recommend, and Blue's Theories has a very understandable breakdown of the root cycles. Or you can just do a YouTube search. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Leave a comment with your own theory. Oh, also, Happy New Year? Yeah, that happened. Time doesn't matter anymore. But speaking of time, have you checked your smoke alarm battery recently? Okay, bye.